So we'll start up with our first speaker, who is Katie Christie. She is a wildlife biologist who works for the Threatened, Endangered, and Diversity Program with Alaska's Department of Natural Resources. Sorry, Katie, I lost my bio of you.
That's all right. Fish and game.
All right, well, we'll just go ahead right into Katie's talk. So she's going to talk to us about lesser yellowlegs and their path to recovery.
Thanks, Grant. Can everyone hear me and see my screen? Okay, I'm seeing not. So my name is Katie Christie. I work for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, Threatened, Endangered, and Diversity Program. And today I'm going to talk to you about the Lesser Yellowlegs Project. But first, I'm going to acknowledge my co-authors, Brad Anders, Jim Johnson, and Kelly Strigley-Werner, all of whom are working towards achieving our objectives. I'd also like to acknowledge our funding sources, without whom this project would not be possible. So thank you. So the lesser yellowlegs is a high urgency species. That is, it is considered to be highly vulnerable to extinction due to steep population declines over the past few decades. So multiple lines of evidence have pointed to these declines. Between 63 and 70% decline has been detected over the past 40 years across the species range. And then in Alaska, over just a 12-year period, recent surveys indicate a 45 to 65% decline. So where are we in the road to recovery process? Well, you may be familiar with this diagram from the R2R guidance document. We are in phase 1. So we are in the process of assessing and learning about the biological science of the species and the social science as well. So we're in the process of incorporating both the human dimensions and the biology of this species. So this species breeds across the boreal forest of North America, all the way from Alaska to eastern Canada. They occur in boreal wetlands, and they migrate to Central and South America. So this species has a huge range covering almost the entire Western Hemisphere. So there are many threats that could be affecting this species. Unsustainable harvest in northern South America and the Caribbean region is thought to be a threat. And I'll talk a little more about this in the next slide. Agricultural practices. This species occurs in wetlands that are surrounded by agricultural areas, particularly during migration and the non-breeding period. Climate change is likely to affect this wetland-dependent species, both in the breeding range and the non-breeding range and migration. Coastal development is likely to affect lesser yellowlegs as well. They occur in coastal mudflats throughout their life cycle. And then habitat loss for a number of reasons, whether it's agricultural development or rural and urban development, as well as climate change, may be affecting this species. So I mentioned the issue of harvest. This is the most obvious and potentially imminent threat to the species. Lesser yellowlegs are the most widely hunted shorebird in the Atlantic flyway. And here's a map where the harvest primarily occurs. So between 48 and 102,000 individual birds are harvested each year in this region, and there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty around these numbers. Nevertheless, these numbers are considered to be unsustainable given the population size of lesser yellowlegs. So we recently completed a tracking study where we put satellite transmitters on birds at various breeding locations from Alaska to Quebec. And so we were interested in tracking them over the course of a year to understand various things about their ecology. So we're interested in understanding linked populations and migratory connectivity, as well as differential exposure to threats of the different breeding populations throughout their annual cycle. And we wanted to identify key habitats and stopover areas during migration. So what did we find? Well, this is a graphical abstract that was produced by Jamie Capleton based on analysis by Laura McDuffie, who analyzed these migration data for her master's thesis. And so what Laura found was that if you're a bird breeding in Alaska, you have a very low likelihood of migrating through this area where harvest occurs. In contrast, if you are breeding in Eastern Canada, say James Bay or Mingan, or you're migrating through this area from northern breeding grounds, you have a much higher likelihood of occurring in this area during the harvest season. You can see that the thickness of these arrows is wider, and that indicates a higher probability of occurrence in this area during hunting season. And then the central Canadian breeding birds have a moderate probability of occurring in this area. What else did we learn? Well, I've circled this region here in light green. This is the prairie poplars region. Lesser yellowlegs that bred west of Churchill, Manitoba, and including the Churchill birds, stopped over in this area to refuel on both their fall and spring migrations. So this area has been identified as an important stopover region for a large segment of the population. And they occur in areas that are often surrounded by agricultural fields. So potholes and wetlands that are surrounded by cropland. I also want to point out the importance of the Pampas region of Argentina. So many, not all, but many of our birds spent the non-breeding period in the Pampas of Argentina. And this is another area that is affected by agriculture. So moving forward, what are our objectives? Well, objective 1 is to conduct demographic studies in Anchorage, Alaska, Fairbanks, Alaska, and Churchill, Manitoba, to identify and understand the drivers of survival and reproductive success in these areas. Ultimately, we would like to create an integrated population model. Objective 2 is to investigate the effects of pesticides and other agricultural practices on lesser yellowlegs, as well as other shorebirds that use wetlands in the prairie poplars region. We also want to partner with farmers, landowners, and tribes on wetland conservation in this area. Objective 3 is to reassess sustainable harvest limits. Why do we need to reassess it? Well, we now know that the threat of harvest does not impact all breeding populations equally. It's particularly a threat for the central and eastern breeding populations. And so we need to figure out how many lesser yellowlegs can be harvested sustainably in this area. We also need to understand the human dimensions of the harvest. So people harvest yellowlegs for sport and subsistence, and we need to understand the economic and cultural drivers of the harvest. We also need to identify solutions that are beneficial to individuals, communities, and the shorebirds themselves. Objective 4, our last objective, is to coordinate with partners and develop a recovery plan. And we are looking forward to meeting for a full day workshop at the upcoming Western Hemisphere Shorebird Group meeting in September, where we will integrate the biological science and social science on this species and hopefully come up with some solutions and move forward with a recovery